the chapter of history that takes you into a world of reality, where a farmer's courage and a conqueror's rise collide to change England's fate. Are you ready to step back centuries? On the pages of history, there are nights written down that cast a shadow of fear over human minds for centuries. Nights when the sky was silent, but the earth was about to face doomsday. One such night descended upon the shores of Britain, in the dark hours of the 5th century, when a simple farmer named Edwin was about to witness a scene that would change the course of generations to come. The air was damp. From afar, the waves of the sea rose and crashed against the shore, making a sound like a wounded animal groaning. The clouds above swirled as though the horns of some unseen war were sounding. Edwin's feet sank into the sand as he walked, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a faint light flickered behind the wall of mist. Beside him was his old friend Oswald. A worn woolen cloak hung over Oswald's shoulders, but his shivering body was not trembling from the cold alone. In his eyes was the look of a man whose heartbeat had been seized in someone else's fist. "Edwin," he whispered in a trembling voice, "we shouldn't be here. This shore is telling a different story tonight." Edwin stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes gleamed with a strange light. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps fear, or perhaps that feeling when a man knows that what is coming cannot be escaped. Suddenly, Oswald tilted his head toward the sea. "Listen. Do you hear that?" Edwin focused. At first, only the roar of the waves. Then, little by little, human voices could be heard. These were not the voices of any village. They were roars, strange chants, the clash of iron, and sometimes cries like the growl of wild beasts. Edwin murmured, "These are not fishermen. This is something else, something terrifying." The color drained from Oswald's face. They sound like raiders, but at such an hour. What enemy takes shelter in the dark to set foot on our land? The light grew closer. Through the mist now appeared boats, dozens of them, their torches burning. The flames danced on the water, wavering, nearly smothered by the waves, but then flaring again. Behind the torches, Edwin saw towering figures, broad-shouldered men carrying spears, their heads covered with helmets fashioned from animal hides. Shivering, Oswald said, "Edwin, we must go back. These are strangers, and strangers always bring blood." But Edwin did not turn away from the shore. In a low voice he said, "Perhaps these are the ones the elders spoke of, those who come from across the sea, those whose tongue no man understands, but whose sword explains everything." At that moment, a voice rang out that shook both their hearts. It was human, but it roared like thunder tearing the sky apart. "Hengist! Hengist!" The name echoed through the air, and even the sand beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Oswald clutched Edwin's arm, terror in his eyes. At the prow of the first ship stood a giant of a man. A bear's hide hung from his shoulders, and on his head a helmet set with the teeth of some beast. In his hand was a heavy sword that in the pale moonlight seemed restless to drink blood. There was no light in his eyes, only darkness, darkness that devoured even light itself. This was Hengist. Beside him stood another man, shorter but more fearsome. Old scars marred his face, and in his hand was a long spear. His eyes darted about as if he had already chosen his prey. This was Horsa, Hengist's brother. Oswald, shuddering, whispered, "Edwin, this is death. These boats are not wood. They are planks of doom. And these men, they are wolves set loose upon our land." Edwin's lips went dry. Slowly he said, "Tonight, the fate of our land is about to change." But neither of them knew that this was not just an invasion. It was the first wave of a storm that would engulf the soil of Britain for the next 7 centuries. Edwin and Oswald stood frozen on the sand. The wind from the sea no longer carried just the chill. It seemed poisoned with something strange. With every gust it felt as though armies of darkness were gathering around them. The line of boats was now clearly visible. On each one stood 5 to 7 men, spears in their hands, some with shields slung across their shoulders, others lightly brandishing long swords. On their heads were helmets made from animal hides, and on their faces a grim severity, as if they had never known how to laugh. In the torchlight, their faces would sometimes flash into view, only to be swallowed again by the darkness. Those fleeting glimpses made the fear even greater. Oswald's lips trembled as he whispered into Edwin's ear, "These men, they don't look human. It feels as if the sea has vomited out its dead." Edwin glared at him, but in his own eyes was the same terror that Oswald had just spoken. Both knew this was the first knock of doomsday for their village. Suddenly, a deep, heavy voice tore through the silence of the night. It came from one of the boats. "Woden! Woden!" The words were foreign. Oswald, panicking, asked Edwin, "What are they saying?" Edwin lowered his head. "They are calling their god, the god of war, whom they believe fights beside them." Fear pressed down harder on both their hearts. If these strangers summoned gods to their battles, then their swords were not only of iron, but carried the power of darkness itself. Now the boats were only a short distance from the shore. The torches flared higher. Reflected in the crashing waves, they made the water itself look as though it were burning. From the first boat a mighty shout rose. "Hengist! Hengist!" At once, cries broke out from the rest of the boats. Every tongue repeated the same name. "Hengist! Hengist! Hengist!" The name thundered through the night, as though mountains were breaking apart and crashing to the ground. Oswald covered his ears, but the voices pierced through to his very soul. Edwin looked at the man standing on the lead boat. A bear's hide hung across his shoulders. The teeth fixed into his helmet glinted in the torchlight. He stood tall and massive, harsh and terrifying. This was Hengist. His eyes were as cold as shards of ice, yet within that coldness burned a strange fire, the fire of conquest. Beside him stood his brother Horsa. Oswald shuddered at the sight and whispered, "Who is that other one?" Edwin's lips were dry as he answered, "That is his brother. They say when the two fight together, no army can withstand them." Horsa's eyes darted through the darkness, as though he had already chosen his prey. Old scars ran across his face, wounds that had never fully healed. His grip on his spear was so tight the wooden shaft creaked under the strain. The two brothers advanced, and the rest of the boats followed behind. Oswald's voice shook as he said, "Edwin, they're coming to burn our village, the women, the children, everyone." Pain flickered across Edwin's eyes. He turned toward the village. A row of small houses crouched in the dark. Inside, the lamps were out, and the people slept in peace. They had no idea that death was coming to knock at their doors. "We don't have time," Edwin said, breathing heavily. "We must warn the people." But Oswald seized his arm, his voice trembling. "If we go, we won't return alive. Didn't you see what they are? Their bodies are like iron. Their eyes hold no mercy. We are farmers, Edwin. Our hands are made for the plough, not the sword." Edwin shook him off. Something fierce had ignited inside him. "Even if we are farmers, this land is ours. If we don't stand now, tomorrow our village will be nothing but a name, only a memory." By then the first boat had struck the shore. Water splashed high into the air. The boats scraped against the sand and came to a halt. One by one the men began to disembark. Their heavy footsteps echoed on the sand, like stones crashing to the ground. Their boots were soaked with water and sand, yet their stride was so firm it was as if the earth itself belonged to them. Hengist raised a torch high. Its light fell across the faces of Oswald and Edwin. They stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. For a brief moment a gleam lit Hengist's eyes. He struck the blade of his sword against the sand. "This land is ours now," he roared. And with that, the rest of the warriors surged forward, shouting their battle cries. The echo of Hengist's sword striking the sand had not yet faded when his men surged forward, with savage roars. Noise filled the air on every side. The clash of spears, the ring of shields, and the cries in a foreign tongue whose meaning needed no translation. In those sounds were the clear promises of war, blood, and destruction. Edwin's heart pounded so hard it felt as though it would burst from his chest. The scene before his eyes blurred. He pressed his hands to his ears to shut out the noise, but it hammered inside his skull like blows from an iron mallet. Beside him, Oswald trembled. Words broke from his lips unbidden. "This isn't the sound of any human army." "This is doomsday, Edwin. It's doomsday." Edwin heard him but did not answer. His gaze was fixed on Hengist, advancing with his warriors. With every step it felt as though the ground itself trembled. The bare hide across his shoulders was heavy with the damp of the rain, but his strength was undiminished. At that moment Oswald tugged at Edwin's arm. "Come on, we have to leave. If we delay even a little, they'll kill us both." Edwin's lips were dry. Slowly he said, "If we don't reach the village, it won't just be the two of us who die. The whole village will burn." He began to step backward, moving quietly so that his feet pressed into the sand without sound. Oswald followed. Though his heartbeat was so loud, he feared. Hengist might hear it and turn toward them at any moment. They slipped away into the cover of darkness, further from the shore. Behind them the noise only grew louder. Now they could clearly hear the raiders singing, songs in an unknown tongue, their rhythm savage, their power enough to freeze the blood in their veins. Suddenly Edwin looked back. He saw a young boy slipping on the sand as he stepped down from a boat. The boy looked up and called out to Hengist. Hengist turned his gaze on him, a gaze that itself was a punishment. The next moment Horsa stepped forward, seized the youth by the arm and yanked him upright. But instead of steadying him, he roared and drove his fist into the boy's chest. The youth staggered and fell, blood spilling from his mouth. The hairs on Edwin's neck bristled. A groan escaped Oswald's lips. "They show no mercy, even to their own. What will they do to us?" Edwin gripped his friend's hand tightly. "Run, Oswald, run!" They fled into the darkness. Their feet left the sand and struck the grass. Behind them the cries of the invaders grew fainter, but fear ran beside them, refusing to loosen its grip. The village was no longer far. Above the small houses, a haze hung in the night. Not smoke from fire, but the darkness itself. For a moment hope flickered in Edwin's chest. Perhaps they could still wake the people in time. But then another sound reached his ears, a sound unlike the shouting behind them. It was the scream of a woman, long, broken, tearing through the silence. It had come from the village. Oswald froze, his face drained of all color. "They're already there. Edwin, they reached the village before us." Edwin's feet felt as though they had sunk into the ground. His mind filled with the faces of his wife and daughter. Tears welled in his eyes, but a heartbeat later they hardened into steel. He clenched his jaw. "We can't stop. Whatever happens, we must warn everyone." He shoved Oswald forward, and together they ran again into the dark. Yet with each step it felt as if the earth itself resisted, as if the trees and bushes in the night tried to drag them back toward the shore. As they neared the village, dogs barked furiously. Their noise split the night, but still the villagers slept, unaware that a storm had already come to shatter their peace. Oswald, trembling, said, "If we go door to door, it will be too late. We must wake them all at once." Edwin met his eyes and gave a firm nod. He remembered the old bell in the center of the village. By day the shepherds rang it to call their flocks. Tonight it would summon not sheep, but people. The two men reached the village square. Edwin seized the rope and pulled with all his strength. "Ton! Ton! Ton!" The stillness of the night broke. Doors swung open. Lamps flared to life. People stumbled from their homes in panic. Women clutched their children tightly to their chests. Men looked at one another in confusion, bewildered at the noise. Edwin, gasping for breath, shouted with all he had, "Strangers have landed on the shore. They are coming! Take up your weapons, or everything will be lost." Panic spread across the villagers' faces. The square filled with cries. Some men dragged out old spears and wooden staffs. Women wrapped their children in shawls with trembling hands. But amid the chaos, Edwin heard another sound, a sound that froze his blood. It was the same cry that had thundered on the shore. "Hengist! Hengist! Hengist!" Now that voice was near the village itself. Edwin turned to Oswald. In both their eyes was the same question. Was this night to be their last? The ringing of the bell still echoed in the air when heavy footsteps reached the village gates. The earth trembled as if hundreds of stones were being struck against shields at once. The first house stood at the edge of the village. An old man had just stepped out holding a staff when suddenly a thunderous roar was heard. A tall, broad soldier with blood-red eyes lunged at him. His sword pierced the old man's chest. The man's scream echoed across the village. Women clutched their children tightly in terror. Edwin's heart shattered into pieces. He gasped and said to Oswald, "They're here. No one can stop them now." At that moment, flames burst from the edge of the village. Hengist's warriors were throwing torches onto the rooftops. The dry straw and wood caught fire instantly. With the gusts of wind, the flames rose higher. The darkness of night turned into the crimson glow of fire. From Oswald's trembling lips came a broken prayer, "God save us." But the only reply to that prayer came in the form of children's screams. A woman was running, clutching her 2 children to her chest. Her shrieks reached the skies, but Horsa hurled a spear that landed at her feet. She stumbled and fell. The children clung to her. Horsa strode toward her, his eyes devoid of mercy, filled only with savagery. He raised his sword, grabbed her by the hair, and yanked her up. Edwin's heartbeat faltered at the sight. He shook Oswald's arm and cried, "If we do nothing, everyone will die. We have to rally the people to fight." Just then, he saw a few young men from the village. They held old spears and wooden staffs. Fear lingered in their eyes, but a spark of courage still remained. Edwin rushed to them and shouted, "We are farmers, but we are alive. Stand for your land. If we must die tonight, then let us die on our own soil." His words struck the hearts of the young men like a spark. They looked at one another, then charged at Hengist's warriors with a cry. In the first clash, 2 farmers fell to the spears, but their sacrifice only fueled the rage of the rest. Edwin picked up a club and swung it with all his might at a soldier in front of him. The soldier's shield staggered. Pain shot through Edwin's arm, but in his heart came a strange peace. For the first time he felt he was not just a farmer, he could fight. Oswald, however, was still trembling. A wooden stick shook in his hands, but he hesitated to move forward. His voice quivered. "This is beyond us. Edwin, they'll crush us." Edwin turned on him with fury. "If we don't stand now, tomorrow our wives and daughters will be their slaves." "Oswald, the time for fear is over." Just then, Hengist himself stepped forward. Firelight flickered across his sword. He shouted in his own tongue, and with a single stroke cut a farmer in 2. The sight shattered the courage of many villagers. Women collapsed to the ground with their children. For the first time, Edwin looked directly into Hengist's eyes. He thought to himself that these could not be the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a beast, crazed by the scent of blood, ready to devour its prey. Horsa roared another command, and his warriors stormed into the houses. Women's screams, children's sobs, and men's cries of defiance blended into one dreadful sound that tore through the night. Edwin's ears rang with the chaos, the roar of flames, the clash of steel, the moans of the wounded. He pulled Oswald close and shouted, "Tonight either we live or our land lives. The choice is ours." His voice reached the hearts of the young men. Once again they hurled themselves at the invaders. But Hengist and Horsa were smiling. They knew this was only the beginning. This village was the first wall in their path, and tonight that wall would fall. The fire had now spread throughout the village. The rooftops of houses were engulfed in flames, painting the sky red. Smoke rose with the wind, mingling with the screams of women, the cries of children, and the groans of the wounded, creating a noise that shook the soul itself. Edwin wiped the sweat and blood from his brow. In his hand was still the same wooden club that had struck again and again against the soldier's armor. It was battered, but his resolve was not. All around him, people were fighting, some falling, some screaming, some resisting until their last breath. Oswald stood behind him, clutching a spear with trembling hands. In his mind, one image kept repeating, how Horsa had dragged a woman by her hair and silenced her scream with a sword. With quivering lips, Oswald muttered only one phrase. "They're not men. They're wolves. Wolves." Edwin turned to him, the firelight glinting in his eyes. Wolves or not, they're feeding on our blood, on our land. Oswald, if we don't act now, tomorrow our children's bodies will burn in these same flames. With that, he stepped forward and struck a soldier with all his might. The soldier staggered back with his shield. A jolt of pain shot through Edwin's arm, but his stance only grew firmer. In that moment, he felt perhaps even farmers could stand against beasts. Suddenly, a thunderous sound split the night. Hengist was advancing. His sword gleamed, his eyes eager to deal death. With a single blow, he cut down 2 farmers. For a fleeting moment, he looked at Edwin. That gaze felt as though it had torn through Edwin's very heart. Edwin's feet froze. The chaos in his ears faded. All that remained was the savagery in Hengist's eyes. In that instant, Oswald seized his shoulder. "Edwin, don't face him. He won't let you live." But from Edwin's lips came an unbidden reply. "If I don't face him, then my life is meaningless." He gripped the club tightly and began walking toward Hengist. Oswald shouted after him, but Edwin's feet moved on their own. Horsa watched and smiled. He struck his spear against the ground and sneered. "These farmers think themselves heroes. Let's see how long their courage lasts." Edwin swung at Hengist. Hengist blocked it easily with his shield. The clash rang out, numbing Edwin's hands. Hengist laughed, a cold, dreadful laugh, then swung his sword. Had Edwin not ducked in time, his body would have been cleaved in 2. Edwin tumbled to the ground, but quickly rose and attacked again. Fear was gone from his heart. Only fire remained, the fire that burns for one's homeland. At that moment, something broke inside Oswald as well. With a shout, he thrust his spear into the chest of an enemy soldier. The man's scream ripped through the air. Oswald's body still trembled, but for the first time courage shone in his eyes. He looked at Edwin and cried, "If we die, then let us die, but not in fear." The fire had now spread throughout the village. The rooftops of houses were engulfed in flames, painting the sky red. Smoke rose with the wind, mingling with the screams of women, the cries of children, and the groans of the wounded, creating a noise that shook the soul itself. Edwin wiped the sweat and blood from his brow. In his hand was still the same wooden club that had struck again and again against the soldier's armor. It was battered, but his resolve was not. All around him, people were fighting, some falling, some screaming, some resisting until their last breath. Oswald stood behind him, clutching a spear with trembling hands. In his mind, one image kept repeating, how Horsa had dragged a woman by her hair and silenced her scream with a sword. With quivering lips, Oswald muttered only one phrase. "They're not men. They're wolves. Wolves." Edwin turned to him, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Wolves or not, they're feeding on our blood, on our land. Oswald, if we don't act now, tomorrow our children's bodies will burn in these same flames." With that, he stepped forward and struck a soldier with all his might. The soldier staggered back with his shield. A jolt of pain shot through Edwin's arm, but his stance only grew firmer. In that moment, he felt perhaps even farmers could stand against beasts. Suddenly, a thunderous sound split the night. Hengist was advancing. His sword gleamed, his eyes eager to deal death. With a single blow, he cut down 2 farmers. For a fleeting moment, he looked at Edwin. That gaze felt as though it had torn through Edwin's very heart. Edwin's feet froze. The chaos in his ears faded. All that remained was the savagery in Hengist's eyes. In that instant, Oswald seized his shoulder. "Edwin, don't face him. He won't let you live." But from Edwin's lips came an unbidden reply. "If I don't face him, then my life is meaningless." He gripped the club tightly and began walking toward Hengist. Oswald shouted after him, but Edwin's feet moved on their own. Horsa watched and smiled. He struck his spear against the ground and sneered. "These farmers think themselves heroes. Let's see how long their courage lasts." Edwin swung at Hengist. Hengist blocked it easily with his shield. The clash rang out, numbing Edwin's hands. Hengist laughed, a cold, dreadful laugh, then swung his sword. Had Edwin not ducked in time, his body would have been cleaved in 2. Edwin tumbled to the ground, but quickly rose and attacked again. Fear was gone from his heart. Only fire remained, the fire that burns for one's homeland. At that moment, something broke inside Oswald as well. With a shout, he thrust his spear into the chest of an enemy soldier. The man's scream ripped through the air. Oswald's body still trembled, but for the first time courage shone in his eyes. He looked at Edwin and cried, "If we die, then let us die, but not in fear." The night had grown even darker. The village houses were burned to the ground. Where once the laughter of children echoed, now only clouds of smoke and the stench of blood lingered. The flames were slowly dying out, but with them the village itself seemed to be breathing its last. Bodies lay scattered on the ground, men, women, children, covered in the same color, the color of blood. The air was heavy with gunpowder and the sickening smell of burnt flesh. Edwin lay half-conscious on the ground. His body was wounded in many places, but he was still breathing. His vision was blurred, yet his ears still echoed with Oswald's last scream, the moment when Oswald gathered his courage to kill an enemy, only to be cut down by a sword piercing through his chest the very next instant. A wave of agony rose in Edwin's heart. "Oswald, you're gone, and I am left alone." He tried to move his body but collapsed every time. Around him was nothing but rubble and corpses. At that moment, he thought perhaps this land truly had fallen into the hands of wolves. A short distance away, Hengist and Horsa stood with their warriors. They were victors, and their eyes gleamed with the same savage light seen in predators after a hunt. Horsa laughed as he looked at the piles of corpses. "This is their bravery? This is their pride? Just a few peasants who thought they could stop us with their fields and mud houses. Hengist, this land is truly ours now." Hengist inhaled deeply, as if he had drawn the scent of blood into his very soul. He spoke slowly. "This is only the beginning. What is the conquest of one village? Tomorrow this entire land will be under our swords. Their kingdoms are divided, their kings are weak, and their hearts tremble with fear. This is England, but soon it will be our England." His words floated in the night air like a message of death. A soldier stepped forward holding a small child who was crying. He asked, "Hengist, what should we do with this one?" Hengist looked at the boy. Fear shivered in those innocent eyes. For a moment, no expression crossed Hengist's face. Then he said, "This one is the seed of our slaves. Leave him alive. They must live with fear forever, so that they tell their children who we are." The boy was thrown to the ground. He kept crying, his voice echoing among the burning houses like a testimony of defeat. Edwin saw it all. Blood was on his lips, but fire lit up once again in his eyes. He whispered to himself, "This is not our end. This is the beginning. One day someone will rise, someone who will stand as a wall against these beasts. Our generation may perish, but our land will never belong to them." Darkness swept over his eyes. Perhaps he had fainted. Perhaps death was taking him. Hengist and Horsa signaled their men. They would turn the village fully to ashes and march ahead. Their footsteps knocked on England's chest with the herald of a new era, an era of fear, blood, and iron rule. In the silence of the night, only two sounds remained, the crackling of burning wood and the cry of a child echoing through the darkness. As the morning sun peeked over the horizon, a pale light spread across the ruins of the village. The scene was no less than a graveyard. The charred timbers still gave off small clouds of smoke, and the bloodstains on the ground looked as though the earth itself had wept for the death of its children. Hengist and Horsa stood in the morning air, surveying their victory. Around them, their soldiers were celebrating, but the brothers' eyes were fixed on the distant horizon. Horsa said quietly, "Brother, this was just a village. But I think if this whole land is so divided, we can swallow it piece by piece." Hengist's gaze held both pride and calculation. Yes, and that is their greatest weakness. He paused, then drove his sword into the earth and spoke. "There is not one king here, but 7. Each rules his own kingdom, but in truth they are enemies of each other. Their rivalries have made them weak." He pulled the sword out of the ground and raised it toward the sky. "Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex. Today they are 7 kingdoms, but tomorrow they will kneel at our feet." His words carried the same terror that had struck the village the night before. At that moment, Edwin's eyes flickered open in a half-dead state. He was still lying on the ground. Blood flowed from his wounds, but his heart was alive. He heard Hengist's voice, every word piercing him like an arrow. Edwin whispered to himself, 7 kingdoms, and their enemies are these strangers. But can these kingdoms ever unite? Will there ever be someone who can bring us together? Tears rolled from his eyes. Oswald's face appeared before him, forever silent now. We may die, but our blood will scream. One day someone will rise. One day someone will stop them. Just then Hengist commanded his soldiers, "Don't waste too much time here. We must move on. A single village gives us the taste of victory, but the whole country will give us the taste of dominion." The soldiers set off with laughter. Their horses' hooves scattered the dust as they trampled over the corpses, heading toward their next conquest. Edwin listened to their departing steps. Inside him, a vow was taking shape. He might not live much longer, but his dream would remain, the dream of turning the 7 kingdoms into one voice. Silence filled the air. The fire had died out. Even the crying of the child had faded. Only Edwin's faint breaths remained, along with the beating of his heart, carrying within it the story that would one day change the fate of centuries. Edwin lay half dead on the soil, but his heart still beat. With each beat, it was as if a new world opened before his eyes. A world where not just a village, but all of England was writhing in pain. It seemed to him as though a map had unfolded in front of him, with 7 lights burning upon it. Each light marked a kingdom. On Northumbria, in the cold lands of the north, nestled between mountains, stood a kingdom. Its people were strong and hardened by war. Their castles along the sea looked like giant stone guardians rising from the earth. Yet Edwin also saw that their endless feuds weakened them. Sometimes he saw their monks lighting lamps in dark monasteries, writing books. Other times he saw their warriors, whose swords thirsted for blood. De Mercia. On the map, a vast stretch of land emerged, fields spread between rivers and forests, forming a mighty kingdom. The kings of Mercia wore their crowns with pride, yet beneath that pride always hid fear. They constantly fought with Northumbria for dominance. Edwin saw their marketplaces piled with grain, but within their palaces lurked daggers and conspiracies. 3. East Anglia. This small eastern kingdom lay close to the sea, making it vulnerable to danger. Its people were fishermen and farmers, their faces burned by the sun, their hearts restless like the waves. Sea winds blew through their villages, but their walls were weak. Edwin felt this land would be the first to fall to foreign invaders. Parta, Essex. Looking to the southeast, Edwin saw a kingdom that called itself East Saxons. Its people were hot-tempered and stubborn. Their small castles and high mounds gave them some defense, but they always lived under the shadow of larger powers. Their kings were weak but defiant, like small lamps that refused to be snuffed out by storms. 5. Kent. This was the very land where Hengist and Horsa had planted their feet. Fertile fields, lush lands, and trading ports, these were what lured them. The kings of Kent had once sought power, but had failed to resist the invaders. Now this land was becoming the first kingdom of the foreigners. 6. Sussex. Along the southern coast lay this kingdom, bound to the sea. Its people were called Sons of the Sea. Their horses ran across the sands, and their warriors were as tough as the salt air. But they were few in number. Edwin thought, brave they may be, but alone they cannot last. 7. Wessex. The brightest light on the map shone before Edwin. This was the kingdom, destined to grow strongest. Fertile lands, strong castles, and an army more disciplined than all the others. Yet even now it was surrounded by enemies. Edwin thought, if there is ever any hope, it may come from Wessex. Before his eyes, the 7 kingdoms turned like the wheels of time, revealing their secrets. Edwin felt that England was a body split into 7 pieces, each at war with the other. In his ears echoed Hengist's voice. This land is ours. 7 kingdoms, 7 hunts. Edwin placed his hand on the soil and whispered, perhaps today you are broken, But tomorrow someone will come to bind you together, someone who will tear through the darkness and bring the light. Days passed since the destruction of the village. The fire had burned out, the bodies either buried or swallowed by the earth. But under the ashes, one spark remained, the spark that would set the future aflame. That spark was Edwin, wounded, broken, but alive. When he finally opened his eyes, he was lying inside a stranger's hut. An old woman was tending his wounds with herbs. In her eyes lived both fear and hope. "Son, God spared you, perhaps because he has given you a great task." Edwin's lips gave no reply, but in his heart echoed the words he had spoken last. "This land is ours, even if buried beneath corpses." Meanwhile, Hengist and Horsa were weaving their plots. Kent was theirs. Now they began to pit Mercia and East Anglia against one another. In the guise of envoys, their men visited every court whispering, "Northumbria wants to steal your lands. Join us and we will protect you." In another court they would say, "Mercia will enslave you, but with us you will remain free." Poison seeped into the ears of kings, and they raised swords against one another. Hengist and Horsa laughed and strengthened their ranks. Edwin's wounds healed slowly, but his heart stayed scarred. One day he said to the old woman, "Mother, I have lost everything, but if I live I will hunt them down." The woman looked to the sky and said, "Perhaps that is your destiny. But remember, one man cannot stop a river. You must awaken the people, make them see who the enemy is." A fire lit inside Edwin. He understood now. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to his land and his people. In Hengist's camp, beneath a great tent, he sat with his warlords. Outside, the clatter of hooves and swords filled the night. Hengist spread a map on the table and said, "We have taken Kent. Mercia and East Anglia are tangled in our schemes. Next is Northumbria. The north is strong but divided by its own blood feuds." Horsa laughed. "And when they all weaken, then we will crush Wessex. That is the only kingdom that might ever threaten us. But as long as they fight each other, Wessex too will remain alone." Hengist struck his sword on the table. "Remember, this land will not be won by strength alone, but by filling their hearts with fear. When even their children tremble at our name, then we will be true conquerors." That night Edwin dreamt again of the burning village, of Oswald's scream, of Hengist's laughter. He awoke with a decision. "I will not remain alone. I will awaken every heart that still beats." These 7 kingdoms may not yet know who their enemy is, but one day they will. With unsteady steps he rose. His wounds had not healed, but the fire in his heart forced him to move. He swore upon the soil, "As long as I breathe, I will fight them. Even if I must hide in mountains or flee into forests, I will be a voice against them." In the darkness, Hengist's caravan advanced, while on the other side Edwin's resolve was being born. On one side shone the swords of conquest, on the other the dream of a wounded farmer. The story had reached the turning point where England's fate stood at a crossroads, to bow before the invaders or to rise again through blood and sacrifice. In the silence of the night, England's sky seemed to herald a coming storm. The moon slipped in and out of clouds, and each time its light fell upon the broken castles of England like a wound. Kent, Mercia, East Anglia. One by one, the invaders' banners rose over them. People were enslaved, fields were burned, and villages lay desolate. The 7 kingdoms, once proud of their power, now lay scattered by their own folly and the enemy's deceit. Hengist's hall. Hengist sat in a great hall. The torchlight carved his face into something more fearsome. Horsa sat beside him, while the other warlords stood bowed before them. Hengist declared, "We have made this land our own. Their kings are each other's enemies, and their people live in the shadow of fear. Now is the time to sink our roots so deep that this land can never imagine itself without us." Horsa laughed. "Yesterday they called us strangers. Today they themselves have become strangers on their own soil." The warlords struck their swords against the table, pledging their loyalty. Edwin's final call. Meanwhile, Edwin was moving through the forests, gathering the surviving peasants and soldiers. His wounds had not fully healed, but fire burned in his eyes. "We are not alone," he told them. "This land is still ours. If we unite, these invaders cannot enslave us." Men gathered around him, hope and fear mixed in their eyes. One young soldier asked, "Edwin, how can we fight Hengist and Horsa's armies?" "They have horses and swords, we have nothing." Edwin scooped soil into his hands and said, "This soil, this is our weapon. If we die for it, then this land will live." Ooh, the last clash. The day came when Edwin and his companions launched a small attack. They struck one of Hengist's caravans. The enemy was shocked that these broken people could still fight. Edwin's men showed courage, but they were too few. One by one they fell. At last Edwin too collapsed, his body soaked in blood. But from his lips came the final words, "This land is ours." Ooh, Hengist's triumph, but Hengist heard the news. A farmer had dared attack his caravan and died for it. He laughed scornfully. "Even peasants dream of becoming kings. But their courage will never stop us." Horsa replied, "Perhaps it will not stop us, but sometimes the cry of a dying man echoes for 100 years. Hengist fell silent. For a fleeting moment it seemed to him that somewhere in the night, Edwin's voice was echoing again. "This land is ours." The end and the glimpse. That night England sank deeper into darkness. One by one the 7 kingdoms grew weaker, while the invaders rooted themselves deeper. Yet Edwin's sacrifice became a tale. Village children spoke his name with trembling hearts, but in their eyes a new light began to shine. That light would blaze in centuries to come. It was that very light which later gave rise to kings like Alfred the Great, who awakened their homeland again. Final line. In the ashes of a burning village under the dark of night, England's history had written a new chapter, a chapter of blood, fear and sacrifice, but also a resolve destined to live for centuries. This was just the first chapter of the story. New chapters will be coming every week, so stay connected. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you for your love and support.